another Answering Adventism clip, about 5-minute clip. The last presentation I did responding to an Answering Adventism presentation was over 2 hours because Miles had kind of given a simplistic view of what Adventists think will happen politically in this country, prophetically, and I felt that it just, when you present it like that, when you say, well, the Adventists think the Protestants are going to take over the government and they're going to impose a Sunday law and there's going to be World Sunday, if you say it like that and you don't show how that is true from the Bible, then obviously a person's going to say, what kind of nonsense is this? So I felt I had to go back, lay down the groundwork, and that's why that video ended up over 2 hours. Because it's very easy to just make a quick summary, simplistic presentation of what Adventists believe without showing it from the Bible. And that's why I wanted to show, yes, this is from the Bible. This video does connect with that video. And so, but since I laid all the groundwork in that video, I don't have to do it again. There is a presentation of mine that I do want to point to in connection to this video, though, and it's called Eternal Principles of Governance. And I'm going to put a link to that. I'll put a link to that in the description of this video as well, because that also connects with this presentation. So this is a 5-minute clip from Answering Adventism, clip from a larger video, as you can see there, link to full video in the description box. I'm not going to put that. I'll just put the link to this video. If you want, you can find the link to that one. I'm not here to promote Miles's videos. I'm just here to respond to them. But Miles obviously thought it was worthwhile putting up this 5-minute clip. He must have thought that this was a pretty good summary of certain things. So he put it up, and that's why I'm responding to this. It's called Jesus on Politics, a Christian Response to the Kingdom Myth.
Kevin Paulson, he's an Adventist pastor and apologist. On his website, AD Vindicate, he had this to say regarding the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson. He says, the new Speaker of the U.S. House claims to base his worldview on the Bible, but he needs to consider certain passages, including some from the lips of Christ himself, which contradicts his thinking regarding the relationship of church and state. When arraigned before Pontius Pilate, Jesus was accused by the Jewish leaders of saying that he himself is Christ a king. Pilate proceeded to take Jesus aside in private, asking him, "Art thou the king of the Jews?" Jesus responded, "My kingdom is not of this world."
Now, first of all, Kevin Paulson doesn't speak for all Adventists, okay? I myself have had disagreements with Kevin Paulson in connection with this discussion of religion and politics. Adventists are on all different sides of the spectrum politically. You have politically conservative Adventists, you have liberals, you have left-leaning Adventists, you have right-leaning Adventists, you have apolitical Adventists, you have various speakers within the Adventist church. You have speakers like Kevin Paulson. You have speakers like Ivor Myers. You have speakers like Doug Batchelor, Ron Kelly, Conrad Vine. There are all kinds of different speakers, and there are differences of opinion. So Kevin Paulson does not speak for all Adventists when it comes to these things. And I just want to make that clear, because this is almost there is a variety of opinion within Adventism when it comes to church and state issues, and when it comes to the nuances of how prophecy is going to unfold. But I will say, as far as I know, when it comes to the 28 fundamental beliefs, Kevin Paulson, I would assume, is right in line with those 28 fundamental beliefs. When a person becomes an Adventist, they're supposed to agree to those 28 fundamental beliefs, And as far as I am concerned, I'm going to give Kevin Paulson the benefit of the doubt that when it comes to those 28 fundamental beliefs, that he is sound. And I would say the same for Ivor Myers. I would say the same for Doug Batchelor. I would say the same for Mark Finley. I would say the same for Conrad Vine or whoever. At least, these are just some speakers that come to mind. That within Adventism, we're supposed to agree on those beliefs. We're supposed to agree with those 28 fundamental beliefs. But like I said, when it comes to the nuances of how prophecy is going to unfold and what behavior as an individual we should take and how we should respond, or whether we should respond politically in the world that we live in today, how we should take our Bible knowledge and apply it, the church allows differences of opinion. The church has never mandated that everybody should be a Democrat and vote Democrat, that everybody should be a conservative Republican and vote conservative Republican. So you have different views politically within the church. And that's what this is talking about. This small clip that I'm responding to here does not in any way present an idea of someone who is differing with the Adventist Church when it comes to our fundamental beliefs, when it comes to our doctrinal beliefs. That's not what's being presented here. This is someone who is presenting his own views, okay, when it comes to how things are to unfold, how things are going to unfold prophetically. And he has his views on that. And so, again, there are going to be differences of opinion on that. So let's continue here.
One congressional colleague has warned that the leadership of the new House Speaker might well demonstrate what theocracy looks like. Whether such will happen under the present speakership, we cannot say.
Okay, so he's saying whether such will happen under the present speakership, we cannot say. So he's saying we don't know. We don't know. But he's obviously, at least according to this quote, go back a little, he's obviously saying that Mike Johnson claims to base his worldview on the Bible, but he needs to consider certain passages. So he's obviously has a problem with Mike Johnson, at least from what I'm reading here, including some from the lips of Christ himself, which contradicts his thinking regarding the relationship of church and state. So this is the view of Kevin Paulson, okay? This is the view of Kevin Paulson on Mike Johnson. Not all the Adventists share that view, is what I'm saying. Kevin Paulson doesn't speak for all Adventists. But the way this is being presented is though all Adventists are walking lockstep politically and would have a problem and should have a problem with Mike Johnson. No, this is Kevin Paulson's view, is what I'm saying. Okay, and I've had my disagreements with Kevin Paulson. We've had our interactions. So again, Adventists have freedom. There is freedom within the church to make decisions on how you're going to vote, who you're going to vote for. And there is the opportunity for people to really look at the scriptures and reason things out to consider how things will unfold.
Responded, my kingdom is not of this world. One congressional colleague has warned that the leadership of the new House Speaker might well demonstrate what theocracy looks like. Whether such will happen under the present speakership, we cannot say. But Seventh-day Adventists know from the inspired writings, referring to Ellen White, that a man-made attempt at theocracy is much in America's future.
Now, that is what I had spoken about in my last presentation responding to Answering Adventism. That yes, we do believe that there is going to be developed within this country an oppressive religio-political system, that is going to happen, but how it's going to happen and how we should respond to that, there are differences of views when it comes to that. how these prophecies are going to unfold, there are differences of views. Okay? So I think it's important to recognize that we are to have agreement when it comes to the 28 fundamental beliefs. We agree as Adventists that Ellen White was someone that was moved by the Holy Spirit, had the prophetic gift. We have agreement on that. But when we read her writings and we look at them, yes, the individual has the opportunity to draw certain conclusions and to make certain inferences, and not all are going to be in agreement on those things. And that's kind of what this video is dealing with. Okay? So let's continue.
Close quote. So, Doug, Adventists will often point to any Christian bringing their worldview into the political sphere as going against Jesus' own teachings.
Adventists will point to any Christian bringing their worldview into the political sphere as if that is somehow violating these principles of Jesus. So they're right off the bat, what is Miles assuming? He's assuming that all Adventists must be in agreement with Kevin Paulson. And I'm saying they're not all in agreement. Okay? As far as I know, when it comes to the 28 fundamental beliefs, Kevin Paulson's right in line. But like I said, Adventists have different views. Adventists have different views politically. Okay? So to say that Adventists would see it as some kind of a problem of bringing your worldview into the political sphere, and to kind of lump all Adventists into the same there are Adventists on the left, there are Adventists on the right. The Adventist Church has never mandated, it's never said don't vote, it's never taken a view and said if you're an Adventist you cannot be involved. No, you look over there, and I'll put a link to an article, The Right to Vote, Should We Exercise It? I'll put a link to this article in the description of this video, and you will see that the Adventist Church has had a history of political involvement and getting involved with issues. Ellen White got involved with the temperance issue because she believed that society was negatively affected morally by alcohol. So the Adventist Church, and the issue of slavery and segregation and these type of things, the Adventist Church has had a history of getting involved. And so we've never taken this apolitical view, but yes, there are differences of opinion within the Adventist Church. I grew up in the Catholic Church. There are differences of opinion when it comes to politics and church and state issues in the Catholic Church. I'll put a link to a talk that I had with a Catholic young man in the video, in the description under this video, and he was not favorable of the present Pope. And there's a lot of Catholics that aren't. Okay, so there are differences of views within the Catholic Church when it comes to politics and political issues and church and state issues and moral issues. These things are the case. So let's continue here.
Going against Jesus' own teachings, with John 8 being the proof text that's often being thrown out as support. This obviously, as you know, is not unique to them. But also, like I mentioned earlier, some Adventists will point to people like yourself as evidence that Protestants are working on establishing a theocracy, which is going to persecute them for going to church on Saturday. So my question...
And we do believe that. And that is something that I'm sure Kevin Paulson and I would believe it, and any Adventist will believe in, that is going to happen. But again, the nuances of how that is going to happen and how we should respond to it and behave with that knowledge, now there are differences on that. Okay? But yes, we do believe that, and that's what I explained in my previous video, answering Adventism's fatal flaw. That's where I dealt with that and why we do believe that. So here's the question he's going to ask here. What did Jesus mean when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world," and should Christians avoid political involvement? Now, again, the Adventist Church has never avoided political involvement. Okay, so right there's a question being set up that is not being true to the Adventist position. The Adventist Church has never taken a position to avoid political involvement. Okay? Let's continue.
And to you, what did Jesus mean when he said, "My kingdom is not of this world"? And should Christians avoid political involvement? If not, and they should be involved, should they shelve their worldview for a temporary only while on the clock one?
Again, should they shelve their worldview for a temporary only on the clock one? I think is how he said it. And I'll say right now as an Adventist pastor, no, we should not. If we are a Christian and God is leading us, we should not shelve our worldview. Our worldview should be involved in everything we do because we answer to God. And when it comes to the Ten Commandments, there are those laws that deal with civil government and civil relationship. Okay? Thou shalt not murder. Civil society is affected by that, so clearly the government should be involved with that. Again, my presentation on the eternal principles of governance gets into that in more detail, but I'll only say this, that if we believe that government should exist, if we believe that, if we don't believe that things should be just lawless, there should just be lawlessness. If we believe there should be laws and those laws should be upheld, then of course we believe that there should be a form of government to uphold those laws. And the activities of government are political in nature. So politics is inevitable, okay? And the Bible is clear. The Bible is clear that there are laws that deal with civil society. If you have a society where there's no laws concerning murder, then you're going to have a mess. So when you look at the Ten Commandments, some of those laws are political and civil in nature in terms of worldly, earthly politics. They deal with civil government and the relationships within civil society, our relationships with one another. Murdering affects people within society. Lying, perjury, slander, these things have an effect on society. Marriage has an effect on society, okay? And stealing, you have to have laws that deal with those things. But when it comes to the laws that deal with our relationship with God, when it comes to those commandments, those are not to be under the jurisdiction of the civil government. That's between us and God. And that's pretty much what Douglas is going to say at this point.
Yeah, there are multiple issues here. I'll just start by saying, if the Christian faith has nothing whatever to do with politics, then there's nothing wrong with establishing a theocracy. Right?
So he's not saying we should establish a theocracy. He's saying if the Christian faith has nothing to do with politics, then if it has nothing to do with it, then there's no basis for having a biblical opinion that would be against establishing a theocracy. But obviously, when we look at biblical principles, and we could see this very well laid out in Ellen White's chapter on the Pilgrim Fathers, right after the chapter following the French Revolution. And she very clearly makes plain the biblical basis for our freedoms and liberties in this country. You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And ultimately, liberty comes from God. Okay? So when we look at the principles of this nation, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, those ultimately are biblical principles because God calls us to freely choose to follow Him. We are not to be forced to do that. So even those principles are eternal principles of God. Our liberties and freedoms are based on God's eternal principles. Okay? Doesn't mean that this nation has always followed them out. Obviously, they haven't. You think of slavery, right? That was a terrible evil in this country. Slavery and segregation and things like that violate those eternal principles. And so there's always been a hypocritical nature to this country when you think of it. And when you look at the image of the beast of the land, having two horns like a lamb, lamb-like, so you have that Christian quality, but then the speaking like a dragon. But the principles themselves is what I'm speaking about. And so Ellen White spoke positively of the Constitution. She spoke positively of the grand old document. When we look at that, when we consider that, we can say, yes, there is a healthy interplay of religion and politics. There is a healthy, and then there is an unhealthy, which is what we see, for example, in the Dark Ages, when we see this unhealthy relationship between church and state, when we see the Inquisitions that I spent so much time talking about last time, and the violation of conscience. And so basically, these liberties, the basis for the liberties that we have in this country, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, ultimately are based on Protestant principles. They're ultimately based on biblical principles, okay? So that's very important to keep in mind. So he's right here, he's not saying we should establish a theocracy. He's saying if that the biblical Christian principles, if the Bible has nothing to say about politics, if it presents no principles when it comes to politics, then you would really have no basis to oppose a theocracy. Okay? But the Bible does lay down principles. It does lay down eternal principles of governance, and that's why I did that presentation.
Basically, what I'm arguing is that we need to, in our behavior as citizens, we ought to stop doing things that make God angry. And what I'm talking about is killing babies. What I'm talking about is sodomite marriages. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, so he's mentioning two issues that would involve the Ten Commandments that deal with civil relationships. Okay, so we have a commandment, thou shalt not commit adultery. And we have a commandment, thou shalt not murder. Now, obviously, murder, okay, these commandments really are encapsulating other laws. For example, you're not going to find a commandment that says, thou shalt not smoke heroin. Thou shalt not look at pornography. You're not going to find, but these commandments are encapsulating these concepts. So a person might say, well, I don't see a commandment that says, thou shalt not engage in homosexual behavior. So obviously that's not even a problem. I saw one comment that says, homosexuality didn't even make it into the top 10 list, talking about the 10 commandments. Yes, it is. It is within the commandment dealing with adultery, okay? That commandment is dealing with morality when it comes to sexual issues, among other things, okay? When it comes to those matters. Okay, so when we look at these issues that he just brought up, okay, redefining marriage. Well, Jesus made it clear that the end times are going to be like the days of Noah and like the days of Lot, like the days of Sodom and Gomorrah. We see that in Luke 17, 26 to 30. We see that in 2 Peter 2 and verse 6. We see that in Romans chapter 1, 26 and 27 specifically. We see that in Jude 1, well, there's only one chapter, and verse number 7. So we also see the same idea when we look at the Canaanite nations, when we look at Leviticus 18 from 22 to 24, that they were engaging in those Sodom and Gomorrah type activities. And I've spoken on all this before. So this is a pattern. The Sodom and Gomorrah pattern is a pattern that has repeated itself. And Proverbs 14:34 says, righteousness exalts a nation. The Sodom and Gomorrah pattern has repeated itself. And so, yes, we should be concerned about those matters because they do affect civil society. We should be concerned about the issue of abortion because that would fall under murder. And just this past Friday night, just this past Friday night, I was looking at the panel discussion of the Sabbath School Panel discussion, and James Rafferty was one of the panelists. John Lomacang was another, and James Rafferty made a very clear statement in defense of life in the womb. Okay, that wasn't the only statement made there. So again, these issues that he's mentioning, these fall within the parameter of those civil laws, the commandments that deal with the laws, moral. They're all moral laws. All the commandments are moral laws, but the moral laws specifically that deal with civil society. Okay, but when it comes to the first 4 commandments that deal with our relationship with God, the civil government does not have the right to impose those upon the people and to tell them who they should worship and how they should worship. The civil government doesn't have that right. Or even the last commandment dealing with covetousness. How would the civil government enforce whether or not you're coveting? How would they do that? How would they determine that? How would they determine whether you're honoring your father and mother? So again, we have to look at the laws and consider that. But I think, again, the mistake here that Miles is making is that he's taking the views of Kevin Paulson, I'm just looking based on this video. Again, I don't know what I don't want to accuse Kevin Paulson of saying anything, but I am saying that there are all kinds of different speakers within the Adventist church, and some will have certain views and some positions on some matters that others won't have. And, as an Adventist, you may agree with one, you might not agree with another when it comes to certain details. And so I'm just looking based on this video here and what's being said here, but it's almost as if it's being presented that Adventists take this view, that we all take this view as Adventists. We're all kind of walking lockstep when it comes to these political issues and how to view politics and our involvement with it. We're all a monolith when it comes to that, and that is false.
I'm not talking about persecuting Seventh-day Adventists for worshiping on Saturday. That is the farthest thing from my intention. I am trying to stop the carnage. That's what I'm doing. And if they say, if their argument is, look,
and I'm wondering in this whole discussion, did Miles or Douglas consider that Ben Carson is a Seventh-day Adventist? And so he's on one side of the political spectrum. But then you had Sheila Jackson Lee. I think she was a Seventh-day Adventist. She was on the other side. But Adventists are on different sides of the aisle when it comes to politics. We're not all on the same page. So I'm wondering, did they consider that? I don't know. Maybe they did. I didn't see the whole video.
Jesus has no opinion about this. We want to argue for a strict separation of church and state. Okay, but is that the same thing as a strict separation of morality and state?
And again, he's bringing up a good point. He's bringing up a good point because there is a difference between church and state and morality and state, or even religion and politics. As I've said, there is a religious basis, as Ellen White points out, in our Pilgrim Fathers for the freedoms that we have in this country. It is in accordance with biblical principles to say that we shouldn't legislate the first 4 commandments. That is in accordance with biblical principles. That's not contrary to biblical principles. And so when Ellen White took her position in favor of temperance men, that was based on a biblical understanding, and it involved politics. You weren't voting for politicians who took a view on that issue. So again, I think to say that there's a difference between church and state and worldview and politics, or morality and state, or religion and politics, yes, there is a difference. We see the unhealthy intermingling when we look at the Dark Ages, when we look at the Inquisition, okay? But we can see a healthy intermingling when we uphold laws that are in line with biblical morality within the sphere of civil relationships. Okay? So again, I think that that's an important thing to point out. From this clip alone, it's kind of presenting a straw man of Adventism. It's presenting this, once again, just like in the other video, it's presenting this very simplistic view of Adventists and Adventism, as if we all take this kind of view that says, I'm going to keep my religion out of my decision making in all areas. I'll just keep it in certain areas, but when it comes to politics, I'm keeping my faith and I'm keeping my morality out of that. And so it's presenting the view that Adventists take that. Now, again, somebody might say, well, you can't legislate morality. Well, every law has a moral basis. So if you're going to say, well, you can't legislate morality, so what do you want to legislate? Immorality? Every law has a moral basis, and we have to prayerfully use biblical principles to determine the position we're going to take. But our church has left it up to individuals to determine that for themselves. Like I said before, growing up in the Catholic Church, there are a variety of views when it comes to politics. And I don't know, is there any church where everybody walks in lockstep when it comes to these issues? Everybody is that way, and where there's been a political test set up to determine whether you become a member of that church? That, I think, could be a problem.
What do they want? Do they want the state to behave morally or not?
They sure don't have an issue, parts of the second table being enforced legally, for example.
See, Miles doesn't speak for all Adventists. He's saying they sure don't have a view when it comes to he can't speak for every Adventist and say this is what they believe and this is what they believe. There are different views when it comes to this. There are different views when it comes to, we may all agree that, an oppressive religio-political system is going to be established in this country that's going to violate conscience. We may all agree on that. We're supposed to agree on that because that's what prophecy shows us. That's what we understand prophecy to show us. But again, does that mean that we're all going to agree now on how to vote and we're all going to agree on all the nuances on how that unfolds? There are differences of views when it comes to those things.
Murder.
Right.
They don't have any problem with that being legislated.
Right. But there are, and the second table of the law is not worldview independent. So for the Christian, abortion is murder. For the secularist, abortion is simply removing a clump of cells. Now, in order to have abortion be against the law.
Now, one of the biblical passages I think that very clearly shows that the unborn human life is just as valuable as the human life. And obviously there are those passages that refer to the unborn as a babe or a baby. But also, when I think of this passage in Exodus 21, verse 22 and 23, it says, and I'm reading from the New King James Version, but as far as I know from my study, and Dr. Ron Dupreez has also written on this, this translation is accurate to the point that's being made. If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life. So, in other words, if the unborn child dies, you give life for life. But if no harm follows, then there's a penalty. So she may give birth prematurely, but the child didn't die. There was no harm that followed. But if harm follows, if there is the death of the unborn, you give life for life. So the Bible refers to the unborn as babes, as babies. John the Baptist leaps in the mother's womb, babes that were fighting in the womb. And here we're seeing that the unborn life, there is the death penalty for killing the unborn in this passage. And so this passage shows that the unborn human life is just as valuable as the life outside of the womb. Anyway, that's kind of an aside here. Well, the church has taken the position that we teach the fundamental beliefs. I have my playlist on the fundamental beliefs, and allows the individual to prayerfully consider how they should now respond to those beliefs. And so the church has not imposed that on its members. The church has not imposed on its members how to be politically. If a member says they don't want to get involved in politics at all, the church has not created a test to say, well, no, you have to vote this way, you have to vote that way, you have to do this, you have to do that. Church has not set that up, has not made that a test. So if you argue and say, yes, the church should impose upon, now preachers have spoken on these issues, individuals have spoken up on these matters, but it's up to the individual to make a decision when it comes to that. But when it comes to the doctrines, when it comes to the 28 fundamental beliefs, we're supposed to have doctrinal unity when it comes to that.
You have to make a decision about which worldview is going to govern that decision-making process. And I'm simply saying we ought to have it be the true one and not a false one.
Yeah, and really that there's no neutrality.
Right.
That's really what it comes down to, is that everyone has a standpoint that they're coming from. And a lot of the thinking, I guess, in a lot of the modern day Christian thinking, or professing Christian thinking even, is, well, we have to shelve our worldview and we have to assume the worldview of, they're not directly saying this, but in essence, they are, an application they are. We have to shelve our worldview and assume the worldview of the pagans to play on their playing field.
Yeah, and that would be wrong. That would be wrong to say something like that. So I think what happens is, and not only God can weigh the motives of the heart, I think that what happens is sometimes individuals don't piece these things together. And so they, in essence, may take a position where they say, well, I need to vote for immorality because that'll save me from the Sunday law, which obviously is ludicrous and ridiculous. I just think that some people haven't put two and two together, but the Adventist Church allows people to really make those decisions on their own. It allows them to do that. And so that's the point I'm repeatedly making in response to this presentation.
And not let anything from our own worldview seep into all that. And that's just not really realistic.
Right. Now, let me quickly say something about the phrase, my kingdom is not of this world. What the Lord is saying there is the basis of his authority is not centered in this world, seated in this world. The monarch of this world is the Lord Jesus Christ, and he's at the right hand of the Father. It's not from this world. So the secular project that I'm opposing as a Christian nationalist is the secular project wants to have the government of our nation be centered in this world. And I'm arguing that we need a transcendental authority, a transcendental right and wrong, overarching all of us. We have to fight for a kingdom that's not of this world.
Now, I think that last part that he said, I think in that last portion he said, that's where the potential for the danger could come in. Okay, I think that's where the problem can come in, because we are in this world. We do know prophetically that there is going to be an oppressive religio-political system set up. Now, he may be saying, we're not going to tell you how to worship and when to worship, and that's good that he said that. We're not, and so it might not be his intention for things to go in that direction. We know prophetically they will, but we should still do the right thing. We should still prayerfully take the opportunity that we have now with the privileges we have and make the most of them when it comes to voting, political involvement. All of that should be done prayerfully, and it is up to the individual to prayerfully look at that. So I think we do have to, as I said, vote our conscience. I think we do have to vote in line with those biblical principles. And I think we do have to consider that there are laws that deal with civil government, and then there are laws that deal with our relationship with God. We have to consider all that. But if you say, well, now I'm going to set up a government that's not of this world, in this world, let's go back and look at ancient Israel. That was a government that was set up, in essence, by God. I mean, there was a prophet, Moses. Moses was an inspired prophet, and he listened to Jethro, and he said to set up judges. And in Deuteronomy 16:18, we have the Jethro principle. In chapter 18 of Exodus, we, in essence, had a representative government in the Bible. You had elders representing people, you had judges, you had officers. So you had this layered government of checks and balances. But eventually what happened? They chose kings for themselves. And this is kind of what I talk about in my presentation on the eternal principles of governance. So even in that situation, okay, where you have the right principles foundationally, things ended up going off the rails. And they said, well, we want king like the surrounding nations. We're going to centralize power, and things went off the rail. Why did it happen? It happened because people were not converted, because people were not surrendered to the Lord.
Let me quickly say something about the phrase, my kingdom is not of this world. What the Lord is saying there is the basis of his authority is not centered in this world, seated in this world. The monarch of this world is the Lord Jesus Christ, and he's at the right hand of the Father. It's not from this world.
Yeah, and he's right about that. God is ultimately in control. Christ is ultimately in control. And yet at the same time, we are in a fallen world. We're in a fallen world. And the Bible calls Satan the god of this age and the ruler of this world. We see that in 2 Corinthians 4:4. We see that in John 12:31, 14:30, 16:11, Ephesians 2:2. In Ephesians 2:2, he's called the prince of the power of the air. And so in light of the fact that we are still living in a fallen world, we as Adventists understand the danger prophecy points to of trying to establish an earthly temporal millennium. In the Great Controversy, page 588, we read that in the union of Papists and Protestants and worldlings, there will be a grand movement for the conversion of the world and the ushering in of the long-expected millennium. We read in Maranatha, page 11, that professed Christians of our time are expecting the temporal prosperity of the church in the conversion of the world and the enjoyment of the temporal millennium. And so though we should stand for and support biblical principles of law and government and stand on the right side of moral issues, we cannot think that fallen man will perfect the world. Jesus will be the one to set up his eternal kingdom when sin and evil are destroyed.
So the secular project that I'm opposing as a Christian nationalist is the secular project wants to have the government of our nation be centered in this world. And I'm arguing that we need a transcendental authority, a transcendental right and wrong, overarching all of us. We have to fight for a kingdom that's not of this world.
Yes. On the one hand, we are citizens of heaven and are engaged in a spiritual battle and have to fight for a kingdom that is not of this world. That's true. But it is ultimately Christ that establishes it in his power. It isn't established in our power. Now, Miles has spoken about the disunity within Adventism. He has spoken about that, and he's used that as an argument against Adventism. He said things like, well, if this were the true church, there would be unity. And so you can't have it both ways. On the one hand, you can't say there's disunity within Adventism, and then on the other hand, uphold someone like Kevin Paulson and say that this is what Adventists believe, and they all believe this same thing. There is disunity within Adventism. That's true. There is disunity. but the true doctrine is within the church. It's the remnant doctrine. And there is a faithful remnant. It's just like Christianity, generally speaking. Not all who say they're Christians are following Christ. And so, in conclusion, this is a fallen world, and while we should do what is right politically and in every other way, Adventists recognize prophetically that there will be no global conversion. The battle between good and evil will continue until Christ comes, and worldly political mechanisms will be used against God's faithful people before he comes, because we are in a fallen world that only Christ himself can fix. And so that's my response. I hope this was a blessing to you.